Friends, this is one of those bittersweet moments where we come to an end of a really great season. We've spent the last couple of months looking at these short stories with Jesus, looking at the parables as we continue in the year of the story to imagine what it is that Jesus' message might be for us as a people of faith, where we find ourselves. And we've looked at some familiar stories and some new ones. I think if you're anything like me, you've been challenged by some of the words that we've heard, not only challenged in what the message is, but perhaps challenged to think about the message a little bit differently. I have enjoyed the opportunity to have a deeper dive into some of these texts and to sort of become reacquainted with them. I hope that they have been instructive for you. And this week, we have one last parable that really is a great summation and a great way to end this journey that we've been on together. So I want to read from Matthew's 7th chapter, beginning in verse 24. Jesus says this, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now Jesus had finished saying these things, and the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as other teachers. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. So this last parable is a perfect one to end on. And the words from this text are actually from the very end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So remember with me that in Matthew's gospel, right close to the beginning of Jesus' teaching, we get this proclamation that is the most complete, the most detailed, the most nuanced presentation of a theological perspective that Jesus offers in all of the Gospels. It provides an invitation into this present kingdom to be aware of the ways that God is working and moving and to live in particular ways in response to that. And so Jesus is really introducing this upside down kingdom, this new reality that his presence has come to inaugurate, and inviting people to live drastically differently, to see things drastically differently in this whole text. It is a beautiful and a challenging word that Jesus gives. It invites us to look at things completely backwards from how we normally do. And then he closes all of that teaching with these words. And he's differentiating between hearers and doers. And if you read through Matthew's gospel, this is quintessential to what he often does. He often puts words in Jesus' mouth that talk about the difference between being one who simply hears and being one who does. Being one who can recite the words, the directives, who can quote the scriptures, and being somebody who lives them out. And so Jesus is drawing a distinction here between those in the crowd who would simply hear what he has to say and perhaps be able to respond or recite it, and those who would live it out. And he says, if you live it out, you're like one who builds your house upon a firm and a solid foundation. But if you're one who simply hears it but doesn't act upon it, you're like the foolish builder who builds on sand. So this is relevant to the text of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount and what that means for who Jesus is and for the kingdom that he's inaugurating. But I also think it is a good and a beautiful summation of this journey that we've been on together. We've been looking at all of these short stories, all of these invitations to see the world differently. And we said one of the things that's beautiful about Jesus teaching in stories, one of the reasons that we've got a whole year devoted to the year of the story is because story allows us to find ourselves in it. Story meets us in different ways in different seasons of our life. Story compels us to respond in various ways, and it can mean one thing to you and one thing to the person sitting next to you on the couch, and a different thing to me, and a different thing to somebody who's in Sudan right now and wondering where they're going to get shelter from the war, and a different thing to somebody who is perhaps a person of color in our country who reads this story and knows that they're perceived as a threat by some people for reasons that they can't understand or comprehend or define, or not because of their actions. And the story speaks to each one of those groups of people, each one of those individuals in different ways, depending on your context. That's the power of story. So Jesus has invited us to find our place in the story, to find our place in the kingdom. And then we have this text that says if we live out of those truths, we're like a wise person. But if we simply have facts and figures and even new ways to understand the parables, and it's all head knowledge, it's not heart knowledge, it doesn't change our hands and our feet and our action, then we're building on a shaky foundation. Things are certain to fall apart. So I think the invitation for us at the end of this season is to consider how it is that we'll respond to all that we've encountered over these last couple of months. I think the invitation is for us to assess our own lives and see how it is that we might build on a more solid foundation. Here's what's interesting to me about this. Jesus is suggesting here that the life of faith is the surest foundation. That living into a kingdom that doesn't have a flag, that doesn't have a banner, that doesn't have somebody sitting on a throne that we can see, somebody whose name that we can recite and that we can go and visit, that the building on that is the surest foundation. That building on a kingdom that is present but entirely missable, that living in a different kind of way, that is the surest and the safest foundation on which we can build. And isn't it funny then to suggest that the most difficult thing to quantify, the most difficult thing to define or to point to, that's the most solid, the most sure, the most certain foundation? It's paradoxical, as is so much in our faith. Because what it's saying is that this kingdom that's present, but hasn't ruled and conquered all things, this benevolent, loving kingdom of God, which we're invited into, that is the surest, truest foundation. This way of living that goes counter to what we're taught, like turn the other cheek. Like how it is that we invest our resources, like trusting in the promise of resurrection, not just one time back then and not just one time at the end of our life, but the resurrection is happening around the clock all the time if we would only develop the lenses to see it, that's the surest foundation. You know, I was thinking about it this week, and I don't know about you, but I like things that are really concrete and very literal. I like things that I can define and understand. And I was thinking about it is that if Jesus would have said, instead of building the rock on this teaching, on these ways of being in the world, if Jesus would have said, build your house on a particular kind of rock, that would have been a lot more clear, right? If he would have said, sandstone, that's what you need to build your house on, that's a sure and solid foundation, then we would have said, sure, we can do that. Or maybe more specifically, if Jesus would have said, build your house on this rock, and all of us just lived in one community, in one place, on one giant rock together, and then we knew that's how it was, but that's not how the life of faith works for us. We don't always get that certainty. We don't always get that clarity. Indeed, what the parables invite us to do is to find ourselves and then to figure out how we live out of that. It's not to find a truth, to uncover something like we have to scratch it off or brush the dust away, and then we possess the truth. No. Instead, it's about uncovering different ways to perceive the world and to live with one another, and then walking that out day by day. Instead of getting the certainty of building on that rock, we get story, we get parable, we get metaphor. We're invited to wrestle. We're assured that we'll find ambiguity and debate about what sort of life this faith will require. Faith. You know, faith that is defined in the book of Hebrews as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. That's what we're to build on, Jesus says. That's the firmest foundation. That thing you can't see, that's the way to go. That's what will sustain us in the storms and the rain and the floods and the wind. I want to say a little bit about that. Matthew expands more than Luke does on the storms of life. And one of the things that we often hope that faith will give us is a get out of storms, a get out of jail, a get out of trouble free card. And we think if we would just pray the right prayer in the profession of faith, that if we would just do what we learned in all of the parables, that then we would get to ignore or get to sort of skate by all the hard stuff in life. I said during in-person worship last week when we were together, I said I was listening back to my sermon that I had recorded online, and I thought, did I say death way too much for the season of resurrection, for the season of life, for the season of Easter? And what I finally realized is that for us as a people of faith, the promise of faith is not that we get to avoid death, that we get to avoid struggle and trouble and trial and difficulty. No, that's not the promise of faith. Jesus never says anything about that. The promise is that on the other side of death, there is resurrection and there is life. On the other side of our poor decisions, like the prodigal son, of our failures and fallings, on the other side of grief and loss, whether it's by our own choice or somebody else, there is life and flourishing and much fruit to be borne. That's the promise of faith. So no, I said last week in in-person worship, I don't think that I said death too much. Death, like taxes, is certain. What's less certain is less clear is the promise of resurrection. The same thing could be said this week. It's certain that we'll face storms, that the rains will fall in our lives, that the floods will rise, that the wind will blow. Storms are certain. The question is, will our lives, will our well-being, will our spiritual health, will our faith sustain us and remain rooted through it? That's what we're invited to think about in this story. I've told you that I was in Mexico a couple weeks ago. And it was interesting, one morning while we were in Tochi, this small town that we've partnered with, we went on a walk. We went on a walk to get fresh baked bread. It was unbelievably good. But somebody was telling me something about the architecture of that part of central Mexico. And I'd heard of adobe, but I wasn't too familiar with it. And we walked up to a wall where you could really see the adobe bricks exposed. And he said, here's the interesting thing about this. Not only is this perhaps the most sustainable way of building, but this is also perhaps one of the most longest lasting ways of building. Even with all of our science and technology, this will stand as well as almost anything. And so he said this wall could have been standing here for hundreds of years. And it's interesting because a few years ago, there was an earthquake. And there were earthquakes before that, and yet this wall stood while there were brick walls, more common, more akin to how we would think about brick buildings that had not withstood it. But this one had. And this had withstood some volcanic activity from Mount Popo that lingers just over Tochi. And still it stood. And he said this, and this made me laugh a little bit. He said, with adobe, if you keep the feet and you keep the head dry, it'll last forever. I thought that was really interesting. And so you have to have some sort of barrier to keep it from getting moisture from the ground or above. But if you do that, it will endure. And I thought maybe there was a metaphor in there for us that if we could keep our minds, our faith, focused on God, wrestling with the promises that we receive through Jesus Christ. And if we could order our steps, our actions in response to that, keep it all going in the right direction, then might we too experience an enduring foundation and faith. Tochi Mizoko and our partnership there is actually a beautiful example of the truth that Jesus talks about in this text. That those who not only hear the words, but those who act on it, who base their life on these truths, on that firm and solid foundation, are wise, and they will withstand the storm. Tochi Mizoko began as a partnership with us here in Kansas City and a church in Arizona 34 years ago. It began with these two churches, I should say, and the people of Tochi Mizoko and the Methodist Church in Mexico at large. And when they began, they didn't start with a master plan. They didn't start really with any idea of what was to be. And I wonder, I'm actually going to ask this question in the upcoming weeks of some folks that were on that first trip. I wonder when they were on the airplane getting off in Mexico City, if they assumed that this would be a one-off trip, this would be one experience in which they would provide some medical and some dental services, and they might never be back to this small village called Tochimizoko again. But they did come back again. They received a warm and hospitable welcome, an incredible partnership with the community there, and they were invited back, so they came back the next year and the next year. And what began as just sort of a partnership with the local church and the United Methodist Church in Mexico began to grow, and eventually a clinic was built, a place where they could do some of this work. And youth mission trips went, and medical and dental caravans went, and things began to take shape, and hundreds of people began to come from the surrounding area each year when this team would come into town to see optometrists and dentists and doctors and nurses to get medical care in a place where that's not regularly available. And so then there is a clinic. And when I was there 16 years ago, that was the last time I was there, the only time I was there besides this year, there was a second story that had just been built on top of the clinic. And that was to house teams like ours. And it had holes where the windows and doors were going to be. And we got to dig out the channels for electricity to be run. And there was no bathrooms or toilets or plumbing yet. But one of the things that I got to do was to help stucco the inside of the walls to prepare it to be painted. That was 16 years ago. There's windows and doors and bathrooms and tile and paint and finishes. And it's unbelievable to imagine what this would have looked like if you would have told somebody in 1989, 34 years ago, what this would look like. You see, if somebody would have pitched that I imagine this thing happening right at the beginning, then probably nobody would have said, yeah, sure, that'll be good, because it would have seemed impossible at the time. And yet this partnership with Tochimizoko was built on faithfulness, on prayers, on the leading of the Spirit, and some bubblegum and duct tape, I think. Just one step at a time. No grand master plan. And that's what it looks like to build on this foundation of the life of faith, that we would simply take one faithful step at a time, that we would wrestle with what these teachings of Jesus mean for us, and that we would simply respond in faithfulness each and every step along the way. That's what God is inviting us into. That's what Jesus is saying. And what happens in this instance and oftentimes in our life is that when we're faithful to that, things that we could never ask for or imagine become realities in a way that has blessed the people of Tochimizoko and blessed the people here in the United States and blessed people across Mexico who have participated in it. As doctors and volunteers, as nurses, as participants, as patients, students who are coming to do dental cleanings, partnerships that are built with people who live in Mexico that consider some of their best friends and family to be here in Kansas City now. It is beautiful and amazing, and all of that came not with certainty and a clear path and a 5-year plan and a vision statement, but simply with a willingness to be faithful to the next step. That's what this looks like played out in real life. But it doesn't have to be halfway across the continent. It can be right in your workplace, in your school, in your family, in your neighborhood, in this community, in this city, in our country. There is so much hurting that needs to be healed. There's so much justice that needs to be proclaimed. There's so much mercy that needs to be shared. There's so much grace that we can reflect into the world. So what about for you? Maybe it's not Tochi or a mission experience. Maybe it's just choosing to live a little bit differently in your daily life. You've heard these things. Now, how will you go and do them? Live them. Practice them. Barbara Essex says this: one does not rightly hear if one does not also do. For Matthew, head, heart, will, and hands are integrated into a life that trusts God and serves humanity. If we've heard correctly, we will live differently. Memorizing Scripture is good and beautiful and important. Reading the Scripture and praying is good and beautiful and important. And if it hasn't moved us to action, we probably haven't got it quite right. So how will you move forward? How will you choose to build? I was thinking this week about this journey that we've been on, and I wondered if we might just sort of summarize the weeks that we've been. And I might ask you, if you remember back to the very first week of the short stories with Jesus, when we talk about the workers in the vineyard, and might we build on a foundation of dignity and inclusion, of uncommon economics, like in that short story we read all those weeks ago? Will we build on a foundation and grow into a person, grow into a community that flourishes and that allows those who are pushed to the margins, who are weary from the world, to find respite underneath our branches like the mustard plant that we talked about? Will we learn to trust the message of the kingdom's bakery, where lives, like 60 pounds of flour, our lives can be transformed and changed by things so imperceptible we don't even realize they're happening in the moment? Might we be changed in that sort of way, and trusting that God is continuing to work in our lives to name that and to celebrate it? Will we learn to build our lives on the persistence of a widow who is dismissed by an unjust judge? Persistence in the face of resistance, pushing always for justice, not only for ourselves, but for the world around us. Will we build on the trust of God's grace above all and open ourselves to the movement of the Spirit? Will we sow joy and love indiscriminately, like that smiley farmer who wasn't very good at his job, walking down the roads as seeds are spilling out, perhaps humming to himself? And will we say that perhaps we don't need the certainty of a sure bet in order to entrust a part of love and grace to other people, and that our job is simply to put the seed out there, even in the most unlikely of places, and let God do what God does from there? Will we build a life with a consciousness of our need for neighborliness, even to those whose names we cannot say, like the lawyer and that Samaritan who cares for a person in need? Will we root our lives in something that is beyond our own stuff and our security and our need to acquire and our desire to have the status that comes from the comfortable living? With the host who was snubbed in the short story of the great banquet, will we build our lives on something more lasting than the approval and the acceptance of those that we've determined can declare our worth and our value, and instead find that on the other side of that difficulty and that frustration, that when we do life in community with people that we often look past and look over, that in the midst of that, we ourselves might find a part of our souls and a part of our life that we otherwise would have missed? Will we learn to trust and build our lives on the truth that when we wander, or when we simply stay home and are lost nonetheless, that with the man with 2 sons, if we could be like each of his sons and come back home, come back to ourselves, come back to relationship, that we would find a God who was willing to meet us exactly where we are, to restore us to our proper beloved childhood, and declare that everything that we could possibly want is already ours? Will we build on a foundation that declares that resurrection is happening all around us right now? Life is triumphing, love is winning, the kingdom is unfolding, and on the other side of grief and loss, there will be life and joy that we cannot experience without going through the death, through the difficulty. If we learned to live and to build and to move on those foundations, might we not only transform our lives and the world, might we also find that we feel more moored, more stable, more strong in the midst of the inevitable storms of life. Might we find that indeed we stay steady when everything feels shaky, and that we experience the reality of the promise of this week's final short story with Jesus. Let's take a few moments for reflection.